Prince Harry has spent years telling the world that his fight against the British tabloids was about justice, not money, not revenge, not publicity. Justice. He said the press crossed lines. He said private lives were invaded. He said powerful newspapers had operated for too long without consequences. And for years, that gave him a very clear role in the story. Harry was the man taking on the machine. But now the machine has answered. And this time, it did not whisper. A High Court judge has rejected the claims brought by Harry and several other public figures against Associated Newspapers, the publisher of the Daily Mail and the Mail on Sunday. The case involved allegations of unlawful information gathering, phone hacking, private investigators, surveillance, and deeply intrusive reporting tactics. It was one of the biggest legal battles in Harry's long war against the British press. And it did not end with a settlement. It did not end with a quiet compromise. It did not end with Harry walking out and saying the truth had finally been exposed. It ended with defeat. Not a small procedural setback, not a narrow technical ruling. A devastating loss, with the claims dismissed and the publisher publicly calling the ruling a vindication of its journalism. And now, the next question is not just what Harry lost in court. The question is what this war has cost him. Because the publisher is now seeking to recover legal costs that could reach around £50 million, roughly $67 million. That does not automatically mean Harry personally writes a check for the entire amount, but it does mean that the people who brought this case could now be facing one of the most expensive consequences of Harry's public crusade against the press. And that is what makes this moment different. For years, Harry's legal battles have been framed as moral battles. He was not just suing newspapers. He was trying to rewrite the public narrative around his life, his mother's death, Meghan's treatment, royal pressure, media intrusion, and the relationship between celebrity and power in Britain. But a moral battle becomes much harder to sell when the court says the evidence is not there, and a fight for justice starts to look very different when the bill could be enormous. The timing made it even more brutal. Harry had returned to London. He was back in the country that he left behind, back in the city where every movement still becomes a headline, back in the place where his royal identity and his tabloid history are impossible to separate. Reports around his visit already carried the familiar sense of distance from the royal family, including the continuing question of where he stays, who he sees, and whether the doors that once opened automatically for him still open at all. And then, on that same return, came the ruling. It was almost too symbolic. Harry comes back to Britain, and the country does not greet him with reconciliation. It greets him with a legal defeat. A prince who once stood at the center of the royal story is now standing outside so many of its institutions, outside the working royal family, outside the palace system, outside the old protections. And now, in this case, outside the courtroom victory he had spent years chasing. This is why the story matters. Because if you look at it only as another lawsuit, you miss the real drama. This is not just about one newspaper group. It is not just about one judge. It is not even just about whether a specific article came from a lawful or unlawful source. This is about the image Harry has built around himself since leaving royal life. The man who said he had to escape a toxic system. The man who said the press had helped destroy his peace. The man who said he was fighting not only for himself, but for anyone who had ever been crushed by tabloid power. That image depended on one thing, the idea that eventually the evidence would prove him right. And now, at least in this case, the court has said it does not. The case was brought by Harry, along with other high-profile claimants including Elton John, David Furnish, Elizabeth Hurley, Sadie Frost, Baroness Doreen Lawrence, and former Liberal Democrat politician Simon Hughes. Their accusations were serious. They alleged that Associated Newspapers had used unlawful methods to obtain private information over a period of years. The claims included phone hacking, the use of private investigators, the obtaining of private information by improper means, allegations around surveillance and intrusion. The kind of claims that, if proven, would have placed the Daily Mail's publisher at the center of another major scandal in the long, ugly history of British tabloids and privacy abuse. And that history is important, because this case did not appear out of nowhere. Britain has already lived through the phone hacking scandal. The public already knows that parts of the tabloid press crossed lines in the past. Celebrities, politicians, crime victims, grieving families, and ordinary people were dragged into stories they never wanted to be part of. So when someone like Harry says, "I believe this happened to me too," many people are prepared to listen, especially Harry, because his story with the press is not casual. His mother, Princess Diana, died while being pursued by photographers. His wife, Meghan, became the target of relentless media scrutiny. His relationship with the royal family has been filtered through headlines, leaks, anonymous sources, and constant speculation. For Harry, the press is not an abstract enemy. It is part of his personal mythology. It is the shadow in almost every chapter of his adult life. That is why his lawsuits have always carried emotional force. Even people who do not like Harry can understand why he hates the tabloids. Even people who criticize Meghan can understand why tabloid intrusion is not harmless. And even people tired of royal drama know that British media history gives Harry's accusations a kind of plausibility before the evidence is ever examined. But that is exactly where this ruling becomes dangerous for him. Because court is not a documentary interview. Court is not a memoir. Court is not a podcast. Court is not a sympathetic audience hearing a painful story. Court asks a colder question. Can you prove it? Not, can you make people feel it? Not, can you connect it to a larger narrative? Not, can you remind the public of other scandals? Can you prove that these specific stories were obtained through these specific unlawful methods by this specific publisher? And according to the ruling, the answer was no. Justice Matthew Nicklin found that the claimants had not shown enough evidence to prove that the information in the disputed articles had been obtained unlawfully. The court did not simply accept the idea that because private information appeared in a newspaper, it must have been stolen, hacked, blagged, or gathered illegally. That is a crucial point, because in the public imagination, if a tabloid prints something private, many people assume the worst. They assume someone hacked a phone. They assume someone paid a source. They assume someone followed a car, listened at a door, bribed an insider, or used a private investigator to dig through a person's life. And sometimes, in British tabloid history, that assumption has been right. But in court, assumption is not enough. A story can come from a publicist. It can come from a friend. It can come from someone in a social circle. It can come from public records. It can come from another publication. It can come from a person close to the subject who is talking more than they should. That may still feel ugly. It may still feel invasive. It may still feel morally wrong. But it is not automatically unlawful. And that distinction is where Harry's case ran into the wall. For years, Harry has spoken as if the moral truth and the legal truth were moving in the same direction. The moral truth, in his telling, is that the tabloids harmed him, harmed his wife, harmed his family, and poisoned public life. The legal truth had to be proven article by article, claim by claim, method by method. And this time, the legal truth did not land where he needed it to land. That is why the Daily Mail publisher's reaction was so confident. Associated newspapers did not respond like a company barely escaping on a technicality. It celebrated the ruling as a major victory. Its position was that the claims were not proven, that its journalism had been vindicated, and that the case should never have been brought in the way it was. For Harry, that is a nightmare outcome, because it is one thing to lose quietly, It is another thing to lose and watch your opponent declare victory in public. And this was not just any opponent. This was the Daily Mail world. The very ecosystem Harry has repeatedly accused of causing so much damage. The same media universe that has made him, Meghan, their children, their house, their deals, their friendships, their family disputes, and even their silences into constant public material. So when that side says, in effect, "We won," the defeat becomes more than legal. It becomes symbolic. And symbolism has always mattered in the Harry story. The move to California was symbolic. The Oprah interview was symbolic. Spare was symbolic. The Netflix series was symbolic. The court appearances were symbolic. Even the body language outside court has been read like scripture by royal watchers. Harry has never just been fighting cases. He has been fighting to control the meaning of his own life. But this ruling hands meaning back to his critics. To his supporters, Harry may still be a man who tried to confront a powerful press and ran into the limits of a legal system that protects institutions. To his critics, this is something else entirely. They will say this proves Harry overreached. They will say he mistook suspicion for evidence. They will say he has built an entire public identity around grievance. They will say he keeps blaming institutions for problems he cannot win in front of a judge. They will say this is what happens when a prince tries to turn personal pain into a permanent legal campaign. And whether that is fair or not, that narrative is now available. That is the danger. Because in modern media, losing in court is only the first defeat. The second defeat happens in the story people tell about the loss. And Harry's critics have been waiting for a clean moment like this. Not a rumor, not a leaked briefing, not a palace source, not an anonymous claim about Meghan, not a commentator guessing what King Charles thinks. An actual court ruling. That gives this story a weight that many royal stories do not have. Most Sussex stories live in fog. Who said what? Who leaked what? Who refused what? Who invited whom? Did William know? Did Charles approve? Did Meghan want this? Did Harry misunderstand that? This is different. There is a judgment. There is a result. There is a loser. There is a next hearing about the consequences. And that clarity is brutal. If you have followed Harry's war with the press for years, this is one of the moments where the whole picture changes. And if you want the next part of this saga as it develops, this is the kind of story worth following closely. Because the headline is not the end. The consequences are still coming. Because the case did not only fail from the outside, it also appears to have suffered one of the most damaging things that can happen in a lawsuit. A key witness problem. And this is where the story gets even worse for Harry and the other claimants. One of the central figures connected to the allegations was private investigator Gavin Burrows. He had been linked to claims about unlawful information gathering, and his evidence was treated as an important part of the broader case. For claimants trying to prove that a major newspaper publisher used illegal methods, someone like Burrows could have been extremely valuable. A private investigator is not just another commentator. He is not just someone with an opinion. He is the kind of person who, if credible, can connect the public suspicion to the hidden machinery. He can say who asked for information. He can say how it was gathered. He can say what methods were used. He can turn a vague accusation into a chain of action. That is why witnesses like this matter so much. Because Harry did not need only to convince the public that tabloids are capable of wrongdoing. Many people already believe that. He needed to convince the court that this publisher, in these cases, used unlawful methods to get this information. And that requires evidence with weight. But during the case, the Burrows issue became a major problem. He disputed or disowned key material connected to earlier claims, and reporting around the trial described how evidence attributed to him became deeply contested. At one point, the case that had looked like a powerful attack on the Mail's publisher began to look like it was losing one of its central supports. That is the kind of moment that changes everything. Because when a witness is supposed to strengthen your case and instead becomes a reason people question the case, the damage is not limited to one paragraph or one allegation. It spreads. It makes the court ask harder questions. It gives the other side room to attack. It makes every dramatic claim look less secure. And it changes the emotional rhythm of the story. Suddenly the case is no longer simply Prince Harry and other victims expose the tabloids. It becomes, did the claimants build too much on evidence that could not carry the weight? That is a very different story, and it is a much more dangerous story for Harry. Because Harry's public brand, after leaving royal life, has depended on certainty. Certainty that he was mistreated, certainty that Meghan was targeted, certainty that the palace failed them, certainty that the press behaved monstrously, certainty that the old system protects itself. His supporters respond to that certainty. His critics attack it. But either way, certainty is the engine. A courtroom collapse attacks certainty at the root. It turns confidence into doubt. It turns accusation into risk. It turns a crusade into a gamble. And now, the gamble may come with a bill. And this is where the story shifts from courtroom drama to financial danger. Because losing a case is one thing. Losing a case and then facing a legal bill that could run into tens of millions is something else entirely. Associated Newspapers is now seeking to recover its costs. The figure being discussed is around £50 million, or about $67 million. That number is enormous, even in the world of celebrity litigation. It is the kind of number that changes the meaning of the defeat. Again, this does not mean Harry personally has already been ordered to pay the entire amount. That is important. The court still has to deal with the consequences, and legal costs can be argued, reduced, divided, challenged, and fought over. But the fact that this is even the scale of the conversation tells you how serious the defeat has become. Because for Harry, the cost is not only legal, it is reputational, it is strategic, it is emotional, and it may become financial in a way that is impossible to ignore. For years, Harry and Meghan's post-royal life has been built around a very specific promise. They left the royal system, but they would build something independent. They would no longer rely on the palace. They would no longer live inside the old machine. They would control their own story, choose their own projects, make their own money, and decide what parts of their lives were public. That was the pitch. Freedom, independence, truth, ownership. But independence has a cost. Security costs money. Legal action costs money. Public relations costs money. Living outside the palace system costs money. And fighting institutions for years costs a staggering amount of money. This case now puts that reality right in front of the audience. When Harry was a working royal, the public argument around him was about duty, privilege, family, and tradition. After he left, the argument changed. It became about whether he and Meghan could turn royal fame into a sustainable life outside the royal structure. At first, the answer seemed obvious. There were major media deals, there was global attention, there was a massive interview, there was a best-selling memoir, there were documentaries, podcasts, projects, appearances, speeches, foundations, partnerships, and endless headlines. For a while, the Sussex brand looked powerful precisely because it was built on conflict. Conflict with the palace, conflict with the press, conflict with the old rules, conflict with the idea that royals should stay silent. But conflict is expensive to maintain. At some point, the audience asks what comes after the revelations. At some point, partners ask what the next project is. At some point, the public asks whether the story has moved forward or whether it is circling the same wound. And at some point, a court case asks whether the claims can survive without the emotional force of the larger narrative. That is why this defeat matters so much. It touches the deepest question around Harry's post-royal life. Is the battle still helping him, or is it starting to consume him? Because Harry's war with the tabloids is not a side issue. It is one of the central pillars of his public identity. He has made it clear, again and again, that he sees the British press as a destructive force in his life. He has connected tabloid behavior to his childhood trauma, to the death of his mother, to Meghan's suffering, to the breakdown of trust with his family, and to his decision to leave royal life. That means, when he sues a newspaper, he is not just making a legal argument. He is making a life argument. He is saying, "This is the force that shaped my pain. This is the force that poisoned my family. This is the force that hunted my mother. This is the force that came for my wife. This is the force I refuse to let win." For supporters, that has always made the lawsuits feel almost heroic. Harry was not just a wealthy man with expensive lawyers. He was someone with the platform, the money, and the personal reason to challenge a media culture that many people believe has hurt countless lives. But hero narratives need victories. They do not need every case to go perfectly. They do not need every argument to land. But they need the overall direction to feel like progress. They need the audience to believe that the fight is revealing something, exposing something, changing something. This ruling creates the opposite feeling. It makes the fight look stalled. Worse, it makes the fight look reckless. And that is exactly where his critics will go. They will not say, "Harry lost one complicated legal case." They will say, "Harry has spent years accusing everyone around him, and now a court rejected the evidence." They will not say, "The legal threshold was difficult." They will say, "He tried to destroy a newspaper and failed." They will not say, "The costs issue is still unresolved." They will say, "His crusade could cost tens of millions." That is how public narratives work. They simplify, they sharpen, they turn nuance into a weapon. And Harry, more than almost anyone, should know that. Because this is exactly what he has accused the tabloids of doing for years. Taking a complicated human life and compressing it into a brutal headline, turning pain into spectacle, turning family conflict into entertainment, turning legal complexity into a morality play. Now the same machinery is turning on his defeat. And there is something almost bitterly ironic about that. Harry fought the tabloid machine because he believed it had distorted his life. But by choosing such a public legal war, he also created a new kind of material for that machine. Every filing became a headline, every appearance became an image, every statement became a quote. Every setback became proof, depending on which side you already supported. And now, with this ruling, the machine has the cleanest material it has had in months. Harry lost. The claims were dismissed. Huge legal costs possible. Daily Mail publisher claims vindication, next hearing coming. That is a brutal package. And for a YouTube audience, this is the part that is easy to miss. The courtroom defeat is only the visible event. The bigger event is what it does to Harry's leverage. Because public figures operate on leverage. Legal leverage, media leverage, family leverage, commercial leverage, moral leverage. For years, Harry's strongest form of leverage has been moral leverage. He could stand in front of the world and say that powerful institutions had hurt him, and many people would at least listen. Even people who disliked him often had to admit that the British tabloid press had a documented history of misconduct. That made his case emotionally believable, even before the legal evidence was tested. But when a judge rejects the claims, that moral leverage takes a hit. It does not disappear. It does not mean Harry has never been wronged. It does not mean the British press has always behaved honorably. It does not erase previous legal wins or settlements involving other publishers. But it does give his opponents a powerful answer. They can now say, He had his day in court. He did not prove it. That sentence is dangerous because it is simple, and simple sentences travel fast. If you are watching this and following the Harry and Meghan story closely, this is the moment where the conversation changes. It is no longer just about whether you believe Harry emotionally. It is about whether his strategy is still working. And that is why this case may become one of the defining moments of his post-royal life. Because there is a difference between being wounded and being strategic.
Harry may be genuinely wounded. He may genuinely believe the press damaged his life. He may genuinely believe he is fighting for something bigger than himself. But strategy is judged by results, and this result is ugly. The court did not give him the outcome he needed. The publisher did not leave quietly. The costs issue did not disappear, and the public conversation did not soften. Instead, everything hardened. Now imagine the view from Montecito. For years, Harry and Meghan have been trying to build a life that is separate from royal control, but still powerful enough to command global attention. Their brand depends on a delicate balance. They must be royal enough for people to care, but independent enough to justify leaving. They must criticize the institution, but not seem trapped by it. They must tell their story, but not look as if they have only one story left to tell. That balance is difficult even on a good day. A defeat like this makes it harder. Because the more Harry continues to fight the press, the more he stays tied to the very world he says damaged him. Every lawsuit keeps him in the British media cycle. Every court hearing pulls him back into the headlines. Every ruling invites another round of royal commentary. Every legal bill makes people ask whether this is justice or obsession. And that is the question hanging over this case. At what point does a fight for accountability become a trap? That does not mean Harry should never sue. That does not mean tabloids should never be challenged. That does not mean wealthy newspapers should be able to do whatever they want. But for Harry personally, the question is unavoidable now. What is the end game? If he wins, he can say he exposed the truth. If he settles, he can say the other side did not want the truth tested. But if he loses, and loses loudly, and faces massive costs, and watches the publisher celebrate, then what does he have? A moral argument, a painful history, a loyal group of supporters, and a new defeat that his critics can replay forever. That is the cost, not just the money, the replay. This ruling will be used every time Harry speaks about the press. It will be mentioned whenever he talks about media accountability. It will appear in every future debate about whether he is a victim, a campaigner, or a man who cannot let go. It will become part of the larger case against him in the court of public opinion. And the court of public opinion has no rules of evidence. It does not wait for full legal documents. It does not distinguish carefully between costs sought and costs awarded. It does not care about nuance for very long. It grabs the sharpest version and runs. That is why the £50 million figure is so powerful. Even if the final costs are lower, the number has already entered the story. It gives the defeat scale. It turns a legal ruling into a financial cliff. It makes the audience feel the weight of the gamble. And for the Sussexes, numbers have always mattered. Not because they are poor, they are not, but because their whole post-royal project has been judged through the lens of money. How much did the deals pay? How much does security cost? How much is the house worth? How much did the memoir make? How much do they earn now? How much does independence really cost? Those questions have followed them from the moment they stepped away from royal duties. And now, the court case adds a sharper question. How much does Harry's war with the press cost when he loses? That is the question his critics will ask with real pleasure.
It is the question his supporters will try to contextualize. And it is the question Harry himself cannot avoid. Because this is not happening in a vacuum. The Sussex brand has already faced a shift in public mood over the last few years. The first wave of interest was explosive because everything felt new. Their exit from royal life felt historic. The Oprah interview felt like a rupture. The Netflix series promised the inside story. Spare gave readers Harry's own version in his own voice. But after that, the public became harder to surprise. Another complaint about the press? Another strained moment with the royal family? Another debate about security? Another anonymous briefing? Another court case? At some point, even dramatic material starts to feel familiar. That is the danger for Harry now. A legal defeat like this does not just damage one case. It risks making the whole public campaign feel repetitive and unsuccessful. It risks turning a serious cause into another chapter in a story some viewers already feel they have heard too many times. And this is where the emotional tone has to be honest. Because it would be easy to make this only about humiliation. It would be easy to say Harry has been exposed, Harry has been defeated, Harry has lost everything, and the tabloids have won.
But the more interesting truth is darker than that. Harry has not lost everything. He still has status. He still has wealth. He still has a global platform. He still has supporters. He still has a family, a foundation, a name, and a story the world continues to watch. What he may have lost is something more specific. He may have lost the assumption that his war with the press is always moving toward vindication. That is huge. Because once that assumption breaks, every future move looks different. If he appeals, critics will say he cannot accept defeat. If he stays silent, critics will say he knows the case collapsed. If he gives another statement, every word will be dissected. If he pivots away, people will ask whether the war is finally over. If he keeps fighting other battles, this ruling will follow him. There is no clean path now. And that is what makes the next hearing so important. Because on July 29th and 30th, 2026, the court is expected to deal with the legal consequences of the ruling, including costs. That hearing may not sound as dramatic as a trial. It may not produce the same emotional headlines as Harry taking on the press, but in practical terms, it could matter enormously. That is where the defeat begins to turn into consequences. And consequences are the part that public figures fear most. A scandal can be survived. A bad headline can be outlasted. A bruising interview can fade. But consequences are harder. They have numbers attached. They have deadlines. They have legal documents. They force choices. And for Harry, the choice is becoming sharper by the day. Does he keep fighting as if this ruling is only one setback in a larger war? Or does he finally accept that the war itself may be costing him more than it is giving back? That question is bigger than the Daily Mail. It goes to the center of who Harry is now. Because when he left the royal family, he did not just leave a job. He left a role that had been built for him. The palace knew what he was supposed to be. The public knew what he was supposed to be. The press knew what he was supposed to be. He was the spare, the soldier, the fun prince, the wounded son, the relatable royal. Then he stepped away and tried to write a new role. Husband, father, survivor, truth-teller, campaigner, media critic, man at war with the machine. But when you define yourself by a fight, you need to know what victory looks like. That has always been the unresolved problem in Harry's story. What would victory actually be? An apology from every newspaper? A safer media culture? A complete public belief in his version of events? A healed relationship with his family? A world where Meghan is treated fairly?
A legal record that confirms every suspicion? A press that stops writing about him? Some of those goals are noble. Some may be impossible. Some contradict each other.
Because Harry wants privacy, but his fight for privacy keeps him public. He wants accountability, but accountability requires reliving the story. He wants distance from the British media, but the lawsuits pull him back into its center. He wants to control the narrative, but every case gives other people a new chance to define him. That is the trap. And the Daily Mail ruling makes the trap visible. This is not just a man losing a case. This is a man discovering that the fight itself has become part of his cage. And if that sounds harsh, look at the pattern. Harry's legal record against the press is not simple. He has had important wins and settlements in other battles. He has forced admissions, secured damages, and kept the wider issue of media misconduct alive. That is why his supporters will argue that one defeat does not erase everything, and they have a point. One ruling does not rewrite the entire history of the British press. One failed case does not prove Harry was never mistreated. One judgment does not mean every painful thing he has said about the tabloids was invented. But this case still changes the story, because it was supposed to do something very specific. It was supposed to show that the Mail's publisher belonged in the same moral category as the worst offenders from the hacking era. It was supposed to widen the map of accountability. It was supposed to prove that Harry and the other claimants were not just relying on suspicion, but on evidence that could survive the toughest test. And that did not happen. That is why the defeat cuts so deep. It is not just one missed shot. It is a missed shot in the battle Harry has chosen as one of the defining fights of his life. And now, every future case begins under the shadow of this one. Every time Harry says he is fighting for truth, someone will ask why this case collapsed. Every time he criticizes the Mail, someone will point to the ruling. Every time he frames himself as a victim of unlawful tabloid behavior, someone will say the court did not prove it here. That is the long-term damage. It narrows the space in which he can speak. And for a public figure whose power depends on speaking, that matters. This is also why his response is so delicate. After a defeat like this, there are only a few options. You can attack the ruling. You can say the court failed. You can call it a whitewash, as Harry and Baroness Lawrence have reportedly done through a statement. You can promise to keep fighting. You can appeal. You can lower the temperature. You can say nothing and let the lawyers handle it. But none of those options is clean. If he attacks the ruling too hard, critics say he only respects institutions when they agree with him. If he stays quiet, critics say he has no answer. If he appeals, critics say he is throwing more money into a lost cause. If he walks away, critics say the crusade ended in defeat. That is why this moment is so punishing. It does not just give Harry bad news, it gives him bad choices. And bad choices are where public images start to crack. For years, Harry has presented himself as someone trying to escape a machine. But the more public battles he fights, the more the machine knows exactly how to use him. The press understands outrage. It understands conflict. It understands royal pain. It understands courtroom drama. It understands a prince who says he wants peace but keeps appearing in the center of the storm. That contradiction is now impossible to ignore, and this is where the audience will split. Some people will watch this ruling and feel satisfaction. They will see a man they believe has complained too much, finally hitting the limit of what a court will accept. Some people will feel anger. They will see a powerful newspaper group escaping accountability again, while a prince who tried to challenge it is punished with costs and headlines. Some people will feel exhaustion. They will not care who is right anymore. They will only feel that the Harry versus the press story has gone on for so long that every new chapter feels heavier than the last. But no one following the royal story can ignore it,
Because this is the first kind of outcome that cannot be softened into rumor. This is not a palace source saying William is furious. This is not a friend of Meghan saying she feels betrayed. This is not a commentator guessing whether Charles will call. This is a court outcome with real consequences, and that gives it staying power. For the Sussexes, that staying power is dangerous because it may collide with something they badly need: reinvention. Harry and Meghan cannot live forever inside the exit story. At some point, every post-royal brand has to become more than the story of leaving. It has to become something built, something sustained. Something that does not depend on the palace, the tabloids, or the latest family rupture for oxygen. And that has been the challenge. Their strongest moments have often been reactive, responding to the palace, responding to the press, responding to criticism, responding to security decisions, responding to how Meghan was treated, responding to how Harry was raised, responding to how the institution works. But a life cannot be only response. A brand cannot be only rebuttal. And a public mission cannot be only a list of enemies. This ruling makes that issue sharper because it shows the risk of staying in permanent combat. Permanent combat keeps attention high, but it also keeps the wound open. It may energize supporters, but it feeds critics. It creates drama, but drama needs escalation. And eventually, escalation becomes expensive. That is the word that keeps returning. Expensive. Expensive in money, expensive in reputation, expensive in emotional energy, expensive in public patience, expensive in the ability to move on. And this is why the £50 million costs issue matters even before the final amount is decided. Because the number is not only a legal number, it is a metaphor. It is the price tag on a strategy. It makes people ask whether Harry's fight against the press has reached the point where even a victory would come at a cost, and a defeat becomes almost unbearable. And if you think that question matters, hit like, because this is exactly the part of the royal story that often gets buried under noise. The real issue is not just who had the sharper headline today. The real issue is whether Harry's entire post-royal strategy is running into its own limits. Because look at the emotional arc. At first, Harry's war with the press felt like liberation. He was finally speaking. He was naming the pain. He was challenging the system. He was refusing the old royal silence. Then it became a mission. Court cases, public statements, interviews, a memoir, a documentary. A constant insistence that silence had allowed the damage to continue. Then it became a brand pillar. Harry as the man who exposes the press. Harry as the man who forces accountability. Harry as the royal who refuses to play the game. And now, after this ruling, it risks becoming a burden. Because if the biggest story is no longer Harry exposes the press, but Harry loses to the press, then the emotional direction flips. The rebel becomes the defendant in public opinion. The victim becomes the gambler. The campaigner becomes the man with the bill. That is the harshness of this moment. It does not require anyone to believe the Mail is innocent in some broad moral sense. It does not require anyone to admire the tabloids. It does not require anyone to dismiss Harry's pain. It only requires people to see that this specific fight has not given Harry the outcome he needed. And that may be enough to change how the next fight is received. Because audiences learn patterns. If Harry sues and wins, the pattern is accountability. If Harry sues and settles, the pattern is pressure. If Harry sues and loses this loudly, the pattern becomes risk. And risk changes how people listen. Supporters become more defensive. Critics become more confident. Neutral viewers become more skeptical. Media partners become more cautious. The royal family, if they are watching, may decide that silence is still their strongest weapon. That last point matters. The palace does not need to respond to this ruling. It does not need to brief against Harry. It does not need to celebrate. It does not need to say, "We told you so." The silence itself works, because the court has produced a story that Harry's critics can use without the palace touching it. For the royal family, that is often the safest kind of story, one that damages Harry without requiring them to enter the fight. And for Harry, that must feel familiar. Once again, he is in the headlines. Once again, the institution does not have to say much. Once again, the press gets days of material. Once again, he is the one who has to decide whether to respond. That is the cycle. And the question now is whether he can break it. Because if he cannot, the July hearing becomes only the next checkpoint in a much longer problem. On July 29th and 30th, 2026, the court is expected to address the legal consequences of the ruling. The costs question will be central. The numbers may change. The responsibility may be divided. The lawyers may argue over what is reasonable. There may be more statements, more headlines, more framing from both sides. But even before that hearing, the public meaning is already forming. Harry fought. Harry lost. The publisher wants costs. The war continues, but the mood has changed. That is where the story stands now. And if you are following this case, subscribe, because the next hearing is not a footnote. It may decide whether this defeat remains a humiliating headline or becomes a financial consequence that follows Harry and the other claimants for years. But the deeper question is not legal. The deeper question is personal. How many more battles can Harry afford to fight in public before the public stops seeing a fighter and starts seeing a man trapped by his own war? That is the question this ruling forces. Because Harry's original argument was that the press took too much from him: his privacy, his peace, his trust, his mother, his relationship with Britain, his wife's safety, his family's future. And whether you believe every part of that argument or not, it is clear that Harry believes it deeply. But now the press can say something back. It can say, "You came to court and you did not prove this case." It can say, "You accused us and the claims were dismissed." It can say, "You tried to make us pay and now we want our costs." That is a devastating reversal. The man who came for accountability may now be the one facing consequences. And that is why this is not just another royal headline. It is a turning point in the emotional architecture of the Sussex story. For years, Harry's pain gave him momentum. Every revelation, every interview, every court filing, every accusation against the press seemed to move in one direction, towards some final reckoning. But this ruling interrupts that direction. It says the reckoning may not arrive the way Harry imagined. It says the system he wanted to challenge can still reject him. It says a public moral case is not the same thing as a proven legal case. It says the cost of fighting may be higher than the reward. And maybe that is the part Harry's critics will enjoy most. Not just that he lost, but that he lost inside the very arena he chose. He wanted the court to examine the conduct of the press. Instead, the court examined the evidence and found it wanting. That does not make the tabloids noble. It does not make Harry's anger fake. But it does make his position weaker. And in royal life, weakness is rarely left alone. The commentators will use it, the tabloids will print it, the palace will outlast it. The critics will repeat it. The supporters will defend against it. And Harry will have to decide whether to keep feeding the cycle or finally change the game. That is why the next move matters. An appeal would tell the world he is not done. A negotiated costs outcome would soften the practical blow, but not erase the public one. A public statement could rally supporters, but inflame critics. Silence could look dignified or defeated, depending on who is watching. There is no move
without a price. And that is the theme of the whole story now. The price of leaving, the price of speaking, the price of suing, the price of losing, the price of building a life around a fight that may never give you the ending you want.
So when people say Harry lost his case, that is true, but it is too small. He may have lost something bigger. He may have lost control over the story of the war itself. Because until now, Harry's war with the tabloids could still be framed as a long march toward accountability. Messy, controversial, expensive, but ultimately righteous. After this ruling, it can also be framed as a crusade that overreached, collapsed, and left him exposed to the very headlines he tried to escape. That is the wound. The court decision is one document. The public meaning will last much longer. And the next time Harry speaks about the press, this ruling will be sitting in the room with him. Not because it proves everything his critics say, not because it erases every harm he has described, but because it gives the other side a simple answer. You had your chance. You lost. Now pay. That is the cruelest version of the story, and it is exactly the version his opponents will try to make permanent. So the final question is not whether Harry hates the tabloids. He clearly does. It is not whether the tabloids have a dark history. They clearly do. It is not whether privacy matters. It does. The final question is whether Harry's personal war against the press still has a path to victory, or whether this ruling marks the moment the war began costing him more than it could ever return. Tell me in the comments what you think happens next. Does Harry appeal? Does he quietly step back? Or does this become the beginning of an even bigger fight? Because after this ruling, the story is no longer just about justice. It is about the price of a war. And Harry has just been handed the bill.